I know this is going to annoy the balcony people, but I think inside cabins are some of the smartest cabins on a cruise ship. Not because they're prettier, not because they feel fancy, but because on most cruises the cabin is part of the trip I use the least. And somehow, it is also the part people are most tempted to overpay for. That's where the whole trap starts. You see the balcony photo and you're thinking about having your nice coffee and breakfast on the balcony with the ocean breeze. Then your cruise actually starts. And for a lot of people, the cabin simply becomes a place to sleep, shower, change clothes, and reset before going out again. That is why I keep booking inside cabins, because if I can get on the same ship, sail the same itinerary, and enjoy the same cruise for less money, I'm gonna think very carefully before paying more for a better room. And honestly, I think it makes sense. Inside cabins are not just the cheap option. For the way a lot of people actually cruise, they might be the better decision. And think about this. If you go on multiple cruises and always get a balcony cabin that costs more, maybe if you went on those same cruises and you did an interior cabin, you'd be able to go on an extra 1, 2, or 3 cruises at the same price as the ones you took with the balcony. So the cabin fantasy is not always the cabin reality. This is the biggest reason why I book inside cabins. Before the cruise, it is easy to imagine the room being a major part of your trip. You picture slow mornings, quiet time, and this perfect little private escape from the ship. That sounds great, but that is not usually how I use the cabin. For me, the room is more like a base camp. I go there to sleep, get ready, cool off, recover for a little while before I head back out. The actual cruise is happening outside of the room. That is where the energy is. That's where the ship is. That's where the vacation starts to feel like a vacation. So when someone says, but don't you want a balcony? Of course I do. A balcony is nice. I'm not saying it's not, but that is not the real question. The question is whether I want it enough to pay the difference. And most of the time, I don't, because the version of the cabin I imagine while booking is not always the version I actually live once I'm on board. A cabin upgrade can feel very important before the cruise and barely change the trip once the cruise gets going. That is why inside cabins keep making sense for me. They match how I actually travel, not how the booking page tries to make me feel. Remember, you are still buying the same cruise. This is the part that makes inside cabins really hard to beat. You are not buying a worse cruise, you are buying a cheaper room on the same cruise. And that matters. A balcony cabin gives you a better cabin. I'm not going to argue with that. If we're only comparing rooms, the balcony wins every time. But a cruise is not just a room contest. You're still on the same ship. You get the same itinerary. You're walking around with the same people on the same decks as everyone else. You're eating the same type of food, waking up in the same ports. That is why I think people sometimes compare the wrong thing. They compare the inside cabin to the balcony. And of course, the balcony looks better. But the better question is whether the balcony makes the whole vacation better enough to justify the extra money. For me, most of the time, it does not. I would rather pay less for the room and use the ship more. That is the inside cabin advantage. It lets me buy the cruise without overbuying the bedroom. The money has to beat the upgrade. This is where the inside cabin really starts to win. The money you save is not just a number on the booking screen or with your travel agent. It can change the rest of the trip. Sometimes that money is the difference between feeling squeezed and uncomfortable. Sometimes it pays for the hotel the night before, which I would argue can matter more than the cabin itself. And sometimes it just stays in your pocket, which is also a perfectly good cruise upgrade. But the biggest reason I care about the savings is simple. I would rather cruise more often in inside cabins than cruise less often because I kept upgrading the room. That is not being cheap, that is choosing the part of cruising I care about most. A balcony gives you a nicer private space. That can absolutely be worth it for some people. But if the price difference starts affecting the rest of the trip, the balcony has to work a lot harder to justify itself. And a lot of the time, at least for me, it doesn't. Because the upgrade is not competing against an empty budget. It is competing against everything else that money could do. Now, if you have the funds, I think it's a great thing to do. Go ahead and get that balcony cabin. So inside cabins are better for sleep. and this does not get talked about often enough. Inside cabins can be amazing for sleep. There is no sunrise sneaking into the room, there's no balcony light, there is no moment where the room starts glowing and your body decides vacation sleep is over. It just gets dark, really dark. And on a cruise, that can be a gift. And if you know me, I love a pitch black cold room. I think you get the best sleep in that sort of environment. On a cruise, you're usually more tired than you think. Even if you swear you did nothing all day, the ship has a way of wearing you out. You walk more, stay up later, eat differently, get more sun, then somehow convince yourself you're going to be fully restored for an early port morning. Good sleep matters. And inside cabins are basically little sleep caves. And I mean that as a compliment. Now, some people hate not having that natural light. I get that. If you feel closed in or need daylight to feel normal, an inside cabin may not be the right room for you. But they do have these little LED lamps that you can get that give you natural light at a certain time in the morning if you want. For me, the darkness is one of the best features. I sleep better and I enjoy the ship more. A balcony can be beautiful but still be bad value. This is the line people do not always like, but I think it's true. A balcony can be beautiful and still be bad value. These two things can exist at the same time. I understand the appeal. There's something great about stepping outside without leaving your room. It makes the cabin feel bigger, quieter, and more special. But the important question is not whether the balcony is nice. It's how much you're actually going to use it. If you're out of the room most of the day, come back late, sleep, then leave again in the morning, that balcony may not do as much for your trip as you might have thought. And that, I think, is where people get caught. The balcony sells the dream before the cruise. The inside cabin protects the budget during the cruise. Neither one is automatically right, but personally, I know which one usually helps me more. Here's an interesting point, guys. So inside cabins make you use the ship more. This is one of the reasons I think inside cabins are secretly better. They push you out. When the room is not the destination, the ship becomes the destination. And honestly, that is usually what I personally want. If I book a balcony, it is easier to disappear into the cabin. That can be relaxing, but it can also make the cruise feel smaller. An inside cabin does the opposite. It makes me go find the quiet spot on the ship. It makes me stay out longer. It makes me use public spaces I already paid for instead of turning the cabin into the main event. That's especially true on bigger Royal Caribbean ships like Oasis or Icon class ships. These ships are built to be used. The whole point is that there is so much happening outside the room. So if I pay more for a cabin that makes me spend more time away from the ship, I'm not sure that always helps the vacation. I know that might sound backwards, but for me, an inside cabin keeps the cruise pointed outward. The ship becomes my balcony, and most of the time, that is a better view anyway. Short cruises make inside cabins even stronger. On a short 3 or 4 night cruise, I think inside cabins make even more sense. Those trips move incredibly fast. By the time you get on board, get settled, enjoy the ship, maybe visit a port, and you start feeling like you've found your rhythm, it's already time to pack up again and get off the ship. That is not the kind of cruise I want to sink a lot of extra money into my room on. Short cruises are about the quick escape. The ship does the heavy lifting. The cabin just needs to do its job. But a balcony can still be nice on a short sailing. I'm not pretending it can't be, but the shorter the cruise, the harder that upgrade has to work. And for me, it usually does not work hard enough. I would rather save the money and put it towards the next sailing because over time, those upgrades add up. One balcony upgrade may not feel like a big deal when you book it, but repeat that enough times and suddenly, you were looking at the cost of a whole nother cruise, and that gets my attention. Match the cabin to the itinerary. This is where I think people should slow down. Do not just match the cabin to the fantasy. Match it to the cruise you are taking. If the itinerary is busy and you're going to be off the ship a lot, an inside cabin makes a lot of sense. If you're going to be using the room to sleep and rest, not as a centerpiece of the trip. But if the view is the point of the cruise, that changes the conversation. Some sailings make the cabin matter more. If the scenery is a major part of the experience, like Alaska, a balcony can move from nice extra to actually worth considering. That is why I do not think the answer is always the same. For a lot of Caribbean cruises, especially the way I cruise, I'm perfectly happy inside. But I would think differently on a sailing where I knew the best part of the trip might be outside the cabin. That is the real real decision, not whether balconies are better rooms, because quite simply they are. There's no question. Balcony cabins are better. The decision is whether this specific cruise makes that better room worth the money. Location matters more than category. This is where I would get rather picky. Not with balcony versus inside, with location. A good inside cabin in a smart location can beat a more expensive cabin in a bad location. I care about noise. I care about what is above and below my room. I care whether the cabin is in a spot that makes the cruise feel easy instead of annoying. That matters more to me than having a window or a balcony, because a bad cabin location can bother you every day. Not enough to ruin the cruise, but enough to make you wish you had paid a little bit more attention before booking. So when I say I like inside cabins, I do not mean I just grab the cheapest room and hope for the best. That is not always my strategy. The point is value. A smart inside cabin is not just the lowest price. It is the room that gives me the best cruise for the money. Sure, I still check the deck plans, I still think about where the cabin sits, and I still try to avoid obvious, busy, noisy areas when I can. Inside cabin does not mean carelessly booking. It means I'm saving money where the upgrade does not matter to me. That is a different thing. Inside cabins are simply not for everyone. I'm not going to pretend that inside cabins are perfect. They're smaller, they have no natural light, and some people don't like the feeling of being in a room without a window. That's completely fair. If you love a slow morning in the cabin, or if a private outdoor space really changes the way you cruise, then a balcony may be worth every single dollar to you. I'm not trying to talk anyone out of a balcony cabin. What I do think is a lot of people upgrade because they feel like they're supposed to. They hear inside cabin and think it means settling. I don't see it that way. An inside cabin is only a bad choice if it does not match how you cruise. For me, it matches perfectly. I want the ship to be the focus. I want the cabin to be simple. I want to sleep well, spend less, and not feel like I paid extra for a room I barely use. That is not settling. That is knowing what actually matters to you. The best cabin protects the trip. This is what it really comes down to. The best cabin is not automatically the one with the best view. It is the one that protects the trip you actually want. If booking a balcony cabin makes the whole cruise feel better, then book it. I understand why people love them. But if booking an inside cabin lets you cruise more often, spend more comfortably, or just feel better about the total cost, then that matters too. I personally don't want to come home feeling like I spent more money only because I was afraid of booking a cheaper room. Inside cabins are not glamorous most of the time. Nobody walks in and says, "Wow, look at this wall." But they work. They do the job. And the money they save can make the rest of the cruise feel better. That is why I keep booking them. Not because balconies are bad, not because I'm trying to make the cheapest possible trip, but because inside cabins line up with how I actually cruise. I spend my time out on the ship. I use the cabin as a reset. I like to sleep better in a darker, colder room, and I do not feel like I'm missing the point of the vacation. To me, that is hard to beat. So yes, balconies are nicer. I'm not arguing with that whatsoever, but nicer is not the same as smarter. For the way I cruise, an inside cabin gives me the cruise I want without making the room more important than it needs to be. That is exactly where I want to save money. If your cabin is a major part of the trip, book the room you will enjoy. But if your room is mostly where you sleep, get ready, and recover before going back out, an inside cabin is not the cheap version of a cruise. It is the same cruise with a cheaper room. And sometimes that is the smartest place to save. I am not saying inside cabins are the fanciest rooms on the ship. I'm saying they might be the smartest.